How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you this evening?
I'm pretty good.
I really appreciate you coming on. Your work, to be 1,000% honest, it has changed my mind about a lot of things. It kind of gives me like a gut, like a feeling in my gut that I'm not very comfortable with. Um, and like to be 1,000% honest with you, like I've gained financially because of cryptocurrencies, and that's what kind of gives me this like it really sucks because I know where they want to take it now, but at the same time, it's personally helped me financially. So I'm like, oh, but then now that I've learned, even just since we've emailed back and forth,
Yeah.
a lot more, and it's just giving me a really like, oh my God, kind of feeling in the bottom of the pit of my stomach. And it's like, well, what do I do? Do I sell it for dollars, which is another central banking tool that like, it just feels like we're on a prison planet now. And it's like, we need people like you to break out of it, to share the information that you've got, which I do want you to briefly, as briefly as possible. I know it's so intertwined, and I've watched, like I told you, your interview with Sire G. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce his name. Your 5-part episode on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, as well as the Mind Wars podcast and the Utopia is a Scam podcast. I briefed on a few others, but at a certain point, it was just like overwhelming, and I'd rather just kind of follow up on your blog.
Right.
But basically, I do want you to kind of brief, what work it is that I'm referring to for people who have no idea what I'm talking about right now.
Okay.
And then I've got a bunch of terms, basically social impact bonds, pay for performance or pay for behavior. I guess payments really, or
Yeah.
script, I guess is the
Script.
script.
Behavioral script.
Your background, from what I understand, is you're a teacher and you were concerned about standardized testing, and it kind of took you down a rabbit hole that has led you to this work, essentially. And yeah, so basically, I've kind of said enough. The other basically terms is Internet of Bodies, Internet of Things, geofencing, which is the one that really made the pit of my stomach do a 360. Digital twinning and 6G, which I had already heard about. Social credit scoring, which I think is maybe one of the more common terms here because people have heard about China's rollout. And I don't think they're, at least the collective consciousness, I don't think is fully aware of how close we are to that here and across the globe. As well as the Internet of Nanobodies, Spatial Web, and Nanodust. I know those are just a few of the terms that are kind of novel to the collective consciousness, so to speak. So if you could just go through.
If you're in on it. If you're in on it, you know all about it. You've known about it for like 20 years. That's what's so depressing.
Right. Well, I'm new to it. So it's really, like I said, it's changed my mind on a lot of things. But the reason I wanted to have you on to talk to you is because I really want to dig deeper into how do we approach our decision making on a day-to-day basis, on a practical basis. And the one thing that you and I really shared, it like deeply resonated with me, and we were in 1,000% agreement on, is just from a psychological foundation. I think that our culture really has some problems. Like you said in one of our dialogues back and forth, it's not like this thing came out of nowhere. Like central banking in and of itself is bad enough. They're just trying to take it to the next level. And it's funny that they're kind of pitching cryptocurrency as like this anti-central banking, like anti-fiat thing. But then when you start digging deeper into research like yours, you find out that that's, a farce, essentially.
Yeah. Well, do you want me just to say a little bit about myself so people know where I'm at and like what I've been working on in like the last 12 months? So actually I'm a parent. I'm not a teacher, although I guess in some ways kind of like I'm an informal teacher at this point of this human capital impact bonds and the Internet of Bodies. But I started just as a parent, which I think is unusual in like a lot of these circles. People were coming in around 9/11 or like other, Kennedy assassination, like other things, and like have these long histories. So really my education is more than sort of a, an NPR listening liberal was through the public schools. And in 2013, Boston Consulting Group was brought in. My child went through all 13 years in the Philadelphia public school system, which is a large urban district, predominantly Black and brown kids, and we're a very poor city. So we were an incubator for almost every kind of privatization maneuver that was going on. And at that point, like that was what opened up like, oh, these things are broken on purpose. They're broken to create profit centers. The profit centers are not actually meant to fix the problem. And around and around and around the cycle goes. So it started with these school closures. And then I was looking at how they weaponize data against schools and children to like further advance profit and control. So it's two parts. One is the making money, and two is controlling the society. And as we know with the, what's going on in Davos for the, so many years, is that their end goal is to sort of imagine a world, a post-human world, literally, like a world where carbon-based human beings are largely replaced by avatars and robots and AI algorithms. And as crazy as that sounds, I never thought in like 2013, 14, 15, that when I was fighting testing, that it would end up like in nanorobotics and transhumanism. But if you keep pulling the threads and following the money and following the power, like that's where I've ended up the past year. So a lot of this, the control system is turning people into data, and then creating investment products essentially around like framing people as debt commodities, really, like as tradable debt commodities around their access to education, but not only that, healthcare, housing, other public, it's the full-on privatization of all of the social welfare state, public benefit state that there is. The further, I mean, it's already been quite torn asunder, but this is the last remnants. And so through these ideas of outcome-based government contracts, they will be essentially turned into private investment opportunities that can then be securitized. So people will almost be like these mortgages. The last global economic crash, they would take thousands of mortgages and bundle them together and slice and dice and trade them and gamble on them. It was just hedge funds and legalized gambling. And now they're going to do it again. But the debt that's being securitized will be debt on humanity and also debt on nature. So it's two phases. Cory Morningstar and Wrong Kind of Green are very good on the corporate environmentalism takeover. So it's through this idea of technocracy, really, like a digital engineered planetary computing system that we can then take over, hijack everything and financialize it for these hedge funds to gamble on. And it's not like, I know later we'll talk a little bit about the blockchain stuff. I mean, it's happening even pre-blockchain, because a lot of these investments are coming not just out of hedge funds, but also people's retirement savings. Like if you've got a 401k, chances are your 401k is invested in this. If you go to a church and you tithe, chances are your church is invested in this too. So it's all, it is a full-on structure that we're trying to address, and with a very long historic context, which my framing is, out of not only enslavement, the history of enslavement in this country, but also indigenous genocide and dispossession, land theft. So, and that's the smart city agenda, is sort of like, we are all being placed in the position of the Lakota in the second part of the 19th century, right? Like, welcome to the club, like now we know what it really feels like to be an empire, like to be a target of inland empire. And that is our cells, and that's biotech. So that's really like, I came into this through education and then through poverty management, like the industrial corporate nonprofit complex that was being managed by predatory philanthropy, really, and turned into these data centers. And then it became, within the last 12 months, really about the biosecurity state. So leveraging our bodies against us. Now the war on terror is actually the war on carbon-based life. Oh my gosh, carbon, anything, you're a national security threat if you're walking around as a healthy person. And that is a whole on propaganda component, which is hard to imagine, like for me, where things have gone in terms of potentially weaponizing frequencies or other elements that we may not be fully aware of that would really hijack the consciousness of people mostly all around the world, for most people, to really like set logic and common sense and understanding of geopolitics and markets and everything that I thought that the left would understand aside, empire, all of it. This, like, they forgot all of it. And now we're just begging the state for our, for our safety. And it just knowing that the state is Google and Goldman Sachs, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, a couple of things that you said there, and again, in one of our dialogues, you said, this stuff isn't new, and I'm not sure how. I've heard you mention like NVIDIA and like the relationship to the Greek god, or I'm not sure what the exact relationship is there, and I'm not sure how in depth your like esoteric kind of conspiracy knowledge is. I wouldn't consider myself an expert by any means, but I've been interested in that stuff for over a decade now. And two things that you said. One, when you were referring to education, I mean, public education in and of itself is the seed that has led to what we're seeing with these pay for better performance. I mean, that's just taking it to a next level. But I mean, public education in and of itself has had, I personally, as somebody who would embrace more of like an indigenous mindset, where you're training or teaching children how to actually survive. I mean, you look at indigenous tribes, 12, 13-year-old children have nearly a 100% survival skill set. Whereas in our culture, you're literally bred to, be a worker. As essentially, public education breeds workers. That's what it does,
Right. And for what industry wants.
Right.
And so, and that continues to evolve. And so now
STEM has now become the big thing, because technology and coding and basically what you're talking about, getting everybody on the blockchain, which, when I first heard about cryptocurrency and I'm so anti-central bank, I'm like, oh, this is great. And the more I learn, the more I'm like, this is their tool to literally put a barcode. Essentially, it's going to be it might be a quantum tattoo, or it might be the injections that they're giving people now, who knows. But it's not about freeing yourself from the central banks. This is another central banking tool, and it's becoming more and more important to go back to, well, how did we even get here? The other thing I wanted to bring up was you were talking about slavery. I mean, our birth certificates. I mean, I don't know if you know a lot about the whole birth certificate racket, but I mean, a certificate is a document of ownership, and who are we owned by, and the whole word magic that goes into the dock, for the birth canal, and all the water references, because it's maritime law based. And I don't want to go too much into all of that, but my point is, this stuff isn't new. This stuff hasn't come out of nowhere. This is just taking what the control system has been to the next level. It seems to be an understatement, because it's like hyperdrive, like the technology.
It's scaling really fast.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think in some respects, and this is what I'm a little bit like, I haven't quite, and maybe people are talking about it and I haven't heard it, but I don't have a deep knowledge of the whole sovereignty movement issue and the thing. But as I understand, like, this idea of a straw man, to me, the concept, so what blockchain is really fundamentally about, people spend, I would say 95% of their time imagining it as currency, some form of currency. Right. And I would say the currency is really the distraction. Like it's a part of it, but the central piece is actually the next iteration of the internet, where the internet comes out of your screen and your phone and your wearable technology, and it lays on the land.
Yeah, and you're a part of it.
Right, and you're a part of it. And so you're interfacing with a cyber physical environment. And they call that the spatial web, or Web 3.0. And so that's the challenge when people spend their time focused on interesting use cases of blockchain, like sidebar things, like we can have this local currency, or we can have a secure place to store our digital media, or we have these, look, we can have some accountable transparency around budgets, or these things. Not that those aren't useful in and of themselves, but if you understand that what this actually is remaking the world with an augmented reality overlay, with a technology that is fundamentally militarized. This is military technology. This is, I mean, Satoshi Nakamoto, whatever, like it's deep state military technology. It didn't just come out of nowhere. And so it's essentially, we're remaking the world as a digital empire that has some nice bells and whistles, but is that where we want to live? And that's sort of where my split in these conversations, and then they've surfaced more recently. People, seem to be upset with me for raising some of these issues, but like there are these two paths. I call it the green path and scorched path. Do we want to live a life, air quotes, where our internal life, potentially even our thoughts, and our external life is mediated by smart contracts, and that we are tracked in micro contracts, and that the results of those contracts shape how we are valued as human capital, which would be like a credit scoring system. And I touched on that before, but I do want to emphasize this issue I unpacked a little bit earlier this week, the emphasis on China. In reality, the United States developed the credit scoring system in the 50s, and the FICO scores. And many, many people here are already discriminated against based on the credit scoring system. Okay, so in my position on this, because it's a global apparatus, is that we need global solidarity.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Both Wells Fargo and Bank of America, the two largest banks in America, have both had multi-million-dollar lawsuits filed against them due to using the FICO credit score.
But we're not talking about that because it's not packaged like, oh, the scary people in China are doing it. And so my framing is, if we understand this as a spiritual engagement that is a world-based spiritual engagement of carbon-based life against AI and quantum computing, we need everybody on board who can have some clarity around what we're actually up against, because it is a predator system that goes even beyond the central banking system, beyond global finance. It becomes almost an anti-life energetic process. So if we then outsource our anger or our fear onto China, we're not actually furthering our approach to the solidarity of the 99% masses of the world who would not want to be taken over by an AI quantum computer. We are just feeding that, right? And we are outsourcing it. It's convenient distraction that we don't have to talk about Bank of America or Goldman Sachs or these other things, or IBM, or, and like that's homegrown, like the stuff that's coming with Google and Oracle. And yeah, sure, China's really good with AI and facial recognition, and they've layered on, and they're a useful test bed for a lot of this. But there is great synergy between Beijing and Silicon Valley and Israel and Boston. I mean, in London, it is all it's a web. So it's
nationalism seems like a farce to me at this point. I mean, the corporations, like you said, I mean, it's Google, Amazon, Huawei in China,
right.
and it's
Ericsson, Nokia, SoftBank.
Baba, yeah.
It's all of that. So if we're not talking about power, and instead we are pointing at other people, that's what they want. That's what Davos wants. And so I don't want to play into that. And I think most people, they just read what they're given, and they pick up a meme, oh, so Chinese social credit. And I did it myself for a while. I mean, I'll admit I'm not perfect, but the more you understand the system, like one of the things, these social impact bonds, they actually are betting on behavior change and brainwashing children, but literally straight up brainwashing them according to a data dashboard. This is this Heckman equation. So Strive Together, based in Cincinnati, is one of the entities working with United Way on this. And they had a whole committee about social emotional learning, SEL, and it sounds good. Like, oh, we care about the whole child's well-being. Really, they want to data mine your child for their mindset. And they had a whole committee of the people who were serving on the social emotional learning committee for Strive Together, which is in over 70 communities through something called Collective Impact. And one of them, his name is Larry Rosenberger, and he's in Marin County, California. And he was in charge of the FICO program for 20, 30 years, and is now on the board of every single data analytics, from health data analytics to debt data analytics to training data analytics, every single thing. Larry Rosenberger is on this board, of 10 or 15 different things that are all about data analytics and risk profiling people. And he's also on this task force for social emotional learning. So before we start making it all about them, what I'm saying is don't throw stones if you're in a glass house, right? Let's get our own house in order and actually look at what's going on in our own backyard before we start pointing fingers. And that's sort of where I stand on this. Not to say there's nothing going on in China. Sure, there's stuff going on in China. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in Boston and New York and Silicon Valley and Chicago.
Absolutely. So as far as looking at forward, as far as how do we solve these issues? What do we do as individuals to connect and spread this information? What's the most efficient way to combat what we're facing? Which I mean, I think you've summarized it as best as I could, is in calling it a predator energy.
Yeah. I mean, right now, I mean, it's hard because I mean, I even had people like message me like, should I have kids? Like, I don't, like very personal, like touching questions. Like, what do I like? Because people are like after this whole year and having it really sink in. And I don't like everybody has to find their own path. And so I would say, there are some people who are working on local organizing, right? And mutual aid and permaculture and things. And if that's your skill and that gives you satisfaction, then like do those things. I personally, like with my gifts, I feel like I'm meant to try to take this message out. And so I've actually connected with a lot of people recently in New York City, which is a center of a lot of the global social impact finance. And so what we are planning to do this summer is I'm calling it like a summer of healing and mending, because right now people are hurting and all the people are hurting. I think there are a lot of people who are understanding the bigger picture who are still very angry at the people who don't yet understand the bigger picture. And like for a long time, they were trying to be generous. And now they're just like, I'm fed up. I'm just really angry at everyone, and then there are people who don't get the bigger picture and they're not getting it. And, they've already gone down the road of medical interventions. Like there's this bigger and bigger gaps. But I think if we actually reframed the narrative outside of what the media, how they want to frame it, and say, listen, we are in a struggle. We are in a struggle, an imperial struggle, where they are trying to turn carbon-based life on this planet into a silicon replica. Like, and I can sort of layer out, but this is actually, we are walking into a war on natural life that people are not fully cognizant of, that people, if they knew, almost everyone on this planet would refuse this if they had the understanding. And so we're trying to, and I don't have any expertise in this, but we're trying to like go to these places, which I do have expertise in, I know where they are, and gather in small groups with intention and talk about what's happening and revoke our consent from these programs. Because in some ways they have to presume that we are going along, right? Like our first gathering was on Sunday. We were outside, we are on Park Avenue outside the Council on Foreign Relations, and David Rubenstein and Kissinger and all of Larry Fink. I mean, all of the people are connected to this imperial project. A lot of it is running through development aid and humanitarian aid, and these creating global disruptions and war and economic unrest so that we can intervene in people's countries and structural adjustment. And we said it's not okay. Like, it's an imperial project, it's not okay. And so we tore up they had a whole special edition of Foreign Affairs in 2016 that was backed by the Rockefeller Foundation. Foreign Affairs is their publication. It was on impact investing. It was on stakeholder capitalism. It was on Bitcoin for the global unbanked. And we just tore it up. We said, we're not doing this. We don't have our consent. And instead we want to build a different world. And we had a group circle, and everyone, there were about 25 people. I mean, this is Easter Sunday, right? And people came, like 25, diverse group of people. And they said, they came because they cared about kids. They were, people who felt isolated and depressed and lost and were trying to find other people. And they were struggling for nature. And I mean, it was none of the narrative that they want to paint us as the patriot, like it was not that. It was like, we actually are fighting for like a centered life, a nature-centered web of relationship. And so we had, I quilted this little pocket with a heart on it because that's my skill from my sacred feminine, my grandmother and my great aunt. And I made this little pocket pillow, and we shoved all the torn up contract in it, and we put our intentions, our good intentions. We put dandelion in it. So this is the summer of dandelion, the dandelion summer, I'm calling it, because it came to me because it's the dandelion are they're medicinal, and they cleanse the liver, which is bile, which is anger. And they're also, I think, a tonic for anxiety. And they're common and they're rooted, and they break up concrete, and they get everywhere, and they're not easy to get rid of, and they're free. And then I read a beautiful story that in the Greek myth, when Theseus went to fight the Minotaur, Hecate fed him 30 days on dandelions. to have the strength to win over the Minotaur. And I think that the Minotaur is actually Wall Street. So we're like, we're actually put out a call for dandelions from all over the world for people to mail them to me. And we're gonna like incorporate these into different ceremonies all over New York. And so we did this first one outside of Council on Foreign Relations. And then we were walking to the next spot. We had another engagement and we turned the corner and we were right at BlackRock. I'm like, oh, here's BlackRock. Okay, come back up and do BlackRock. And there's a platform that's being created called Inspired Ground. I think it's inspiredgroundproject.com. And we're going to host these revocations of consent, because not everyone is going to be in a position to make a town or build a farm or, you know, and to me, as a city dweller who loves my city, I don't want to give it up. I don't want to walk away from the life I had. And I don't really feel like, honestly, if people created separate communities that were perceived of as a threat to empire, that they wouldn't just shoot you up with a directed energy weapon.
Right.
You know, like, I'm sorry. I mean, DARPA has all their toys. I don't like, they might let a few people go on for a certain amount of time, but I don't, for me as a 50-plus-year-old woman, I don't want to live in this world and I don't really want to run away. And so I think, to me, I keep looking back to the ghost dance period, you know, the like a spiritual, a mystical connection, you know, not trying to appropriate that, but just what does that look like in this moment of facing this closing in empire and appealing to some larger force at work. And clearly that came to a terrible end for them, but it was a threat. It was the most profound threat to US empire for them to act in that way. And so to me, that's sort of where I'm at right now. And I'm not saying that's everybody's path, but I don't see a simple stop. I don't see a tweak. I don't see electoral politics as the answer. You know, I don't, you know, maybe there are people who are programmers who can hack different things. Like, that's not my skill set. You know, maybe there's a role for that in there somewhere. I'd be open to, I mean, of course, if people know that, they're probably not telling me. They're telling the general public about it.
Well, one thing that you said that kind of, you know, kind of shifted my perspective, my frame of mind on it is like, you know, the cryptography that's being used to implement the infrastructure, the actual like data storage centers and all of these sorts of things. The electromagnetic frequencies are such that it's actually like altering our DNA, and it's not, you know, natural is a word that I struggle with too, because I do believe that that's a fine line. Is like, what we created something. Where do you draw the line between natural and artificial? But for me, you wrote an article about, or I don't know if you wrote it or you reposted it, about selective animism. And I really,
that was my friend Tad. Yeah, it was great.
Yes, so that was really good, because I heard you say something about, you know, humans are very like overly human centered. And I agree with what you're saying, but it's to a point where it's almost like our worldview is off. And so we don't understand ourselves as part of a larger ecosystem. Right. And so if we were actually looking to benefit the whole human, we wouldn't be, you know, killing off coyotes or wolves or whatever doesn't fit in our food chain because they're eating our chickens, or they're eating, like, we just, for thousands of years, we've, you know, eliminated any tribe who didn't grow all of their own food and practice animal husbandry in a similar way that we did. It was all about, you know, the way our culture perceived the food chain. And fortunately, we're starting to see, you know, you hear about the food web now, and our worldview is starting. I do see some good things in the changes in language and the changes in worldview, but it still seems like we're stuck in this mindset of like, humans are, you know, we're here to be the dominion of the earth, or we're separate from the planet. And I don't think that if you continue to have that worldview of humans being separate from the rest of nature, then you're gonna just continue to be a virus or a parasite on the earth. But if you change your worldview, if you change your worldview to see yourself as part of nature, then I don't think it's a bad thing to want to benefit humanity, because you're not going to do those things that hurt the planet. you know that that's your home, and you need that to thrive in order for you to thrive. So it's like this weird thing where it's like, if you understand your humanity to be a part of the planet, then it's not really a bad thing to want to benefit humanity. But when you see yourself as separate from nature or from the planet, and then you're just working to benefit yourself, and you're treating the planet as a resource, as a human resource, basically, to extract rare minerals and resources and all of this, then that actually in the long run destroys humanity. You know, I heard somebody say, when you talk about saving the world, you're not actually talking about saving the world, you're talking about saving humanity. The world's going to be just
exactly
fine.
right. Well, I mean, and that's the thing that's coming next, because there's this intersection of within, so all of the pay for success contracting, that it's a bit complicated, but this idea of the spatial web, of the sensor networks that create this augmented reality layer, that we are now not directly connected to the world, but there's this intermediary layer of digital information and digital access. Okay, that is, and that's why everything is being reskilled into coding, because that actually has to be built.
Like the
It's augmented, it's mixed reality, cyber physical. Yeah.
Yep.
And most people are, I mean, they kind of get it. They don't fully comprehend what I'm talking about. With the QR codes are the baby, steps into that.
Right.
And so there will be a further disconnect, even an energetic disconnect from us to directly to interface. It will be this mechanical, a mechanized EMF based system. The justification for a lot of this is going to actually come under the greening movement and sustainability. And again, I had mentioned like Wrong Kind of Green, Clive Spash, The Economist, and Cory Morningstar and Winter Oak. Like, they're very good on corporate environmentalism, because this environmental social governance, ESG investing that BlackRock et al. Are going to be embracing now, it all runs on impact, and impact is data, and data is technology, and technology is 5G and sensor networks. So they will say, to save the planet, we need to cover everything sensor so we can track it all. We need to build a planetary computer to model it to save the planet. Only we're going to kill the planet, but we won't mention that till later. But like, we need to get our profit, and the profit depends on getting the impact data. So we're going to put all the sensors, we're going to make everybody kick out of their old jobs. So you can't have a real teacher anymore. You can't have a real doctor. You can't have, the elders are all cared by robots. Humans only can do the data cleanup to code this stupid global prison planet, and that's what we're in the process of seeing underway, with all sorts of profit verticals built in. And so that fake kind of green, they are going to use something called One Health, which is the World Bank's program, because this is all about structural adjustment, global political economy, to say, here's people, okay, over here, people, and public health and viruses and scary things. Here's nature, here's the climate and the environment, and we're doing terrible things. Oh, here's animals. So they have these three things, like people, climate, and animals. And then there's this intersecting sector, and they're going to say, people, don't get near animals because you're going to hurt them and they're going to hurt you. And they're going to say, people, don't go near the environment because same thing, it'll hurt you and you'll hurt it. And animals, and they're going to try to keep everything separate so that they can lay claim on it all and they can track it all. And that they can essentially leverage this biosecurity state, perpetual pandemic, viral, medical solutionism, to create profit centers for pandemic bonds and vaccine bonds, and to have the rich people, as Agenda 21, the Agenda 21 folks have clearly laid out, right, push everyone into smart cities, these stack and pack things, and then they lay claim to all of the open space. And they say, but because it's you can't be trusted. And it's not that, it's that the structure has been built that people are dissociated from their natural beingness.
Yep.
It's not that people are given a choice and they say, oh, I don't want to be a natural being. They're just born into this structure that tells you how to be, and then you be that way, but it's not the right way. And it's not necessarily a choice you make. You're just pushed into it. And that is the culture. So we have to awaken to what that is. And then we have to start to try to back out of it. But the first thing is actually seeing that the structure even exists. It's like, the matrix, right? Like waking up to that you're in this structure.
Right.
And it goes so against everything we've been taught about what the United States is, what democracy is, what, like what our identity is, that people have to be able to unlearn, process, because it's not easy. I mean, I did this and it wasn't even that long ago. It took me about a year to, like, you have terrible guilt. You have to work. But then if you just stay in the guilt mode, you're not going to be ready to fight AI quantum computing. So you got to own it. You got to process it. You have to have support. You have to get there. And then we have to find some sort of principled unity to face off against this terrible thing. Because if not, we're going to lose it all, not just for humans, but for the bees, for the moss. I mean, that's Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's someone whose teachings I value greatly. She's a professor of biology at the SUNY Forestry School in New York, and she's citizen Potawatomi Nation. And she's like, the humans are the young siblings. We should be listening, humble, and listen to the old beings. Like, listen to the rocks and the trees and the other stuff. Like, we don't know what the heck we're doing, and we need to be good relatives, and we don't know how to do that, really.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that point, because this is actually exactly where I wanted to take this discussion. I don't think I articulated myself as well as I wanted to a minute ago, but what you just said helped me, helped some synapses in my brain connect. And essentially, I think the ultimate issue is one of psychology. We don't see the earth as a living being. We don't see the earth as our mother. And give me just a second here. I want to bring up a quote that I had written down, that you had said, and I forget which podcast it was, but when you said it, it was like, oh my God, hit me right in my heart. Indigenous worldview has always been a direct threat and confrontation to this mechanized, so-called enlightenment scientist version of the world. I think you really nailed it there. As somebody who looks at things, I would say, from a big picture meta level, I'm a philosopher. That's what I have my degree in. I try to see everything from both sides. But ultimately, I do see this as a psychological issue, and we've severed ourselves from Mother Earth, and that psychological schism allows us to move forward with digital identity and geofencing. It gives that collective consciousness that, oh well, we're the scourge of the earth, so we might as well do this. It'll be better than our destiny to ruin the earth, when that's not really our destiny. If we were to just ask the indigenous people, like, hey, how did you do it for millions of years before the last 10,000 where our culture fucked it up? Excuse my language.
Yeah. Well, that quote, I had the chance this summer to write a piece for Ava magazine, like Women, Earth, Soul, I think it is, based out of the UK. And I had written on some time I spent on Lakota land in South Dakota last summer. And John Trudell had been a major inspiration to me in terms of understanding his teachings, the idea of predator energy. That is all from his work. But they were also celebrating women, and including different profiles of women at different stages of life, and one who had passed. And so I actually was asked to write one for someone who had already died, and his wife's name was Tina Manning Trudell, and she was actually likely murdered by the U.S. government in a house fire, and with her unborn child and 2 small children and mother. And she was a water protector on her lands. I believe it was in Idaho, and she was doing that work, after her death and processing it, that's when John Trudell really came into his own around his work in music and poetry and spoken word. And he'd always been an activist, but layering that in, and he talked about that Tina had given him these lines, these lines to share the work out. And that when people would say that she was murdered because of his activism, he said that's really discrediting her power, because she was the keeper of the old ways. She was the one who took care of the elders and listened to the stories and took care of the children and took care of the water and was with her people. They were touring, and she said they needed to go home. They needed to go back to their lands and do that work of being on the land with the people, and in their traditional ways. And so I think, you know, for me, like facing this fourth industrial revolution, right? And understanding that this is this end game of, I kind of frame it as artificial intelligence as the last stage settler colonizer. Only this time, like the target of the colonization is all of natural life. Like, and I'm saying this through biotechnology, literally, when you say you're not sure about natural life, I'm saying through manufactured genetic manipulation, like through CRISPR technologies, through nanorobotics. Like, I think we can understand that technology is not a natural hybridization, that is a military technology that is being introduced into our bodies and our environmental systems. And so, and in fact, she was a water I mean, she was protecting her water on her lands, and now they're talking about using nanotechnology in water purification, right? And nobody knows this, even the environmental movements. Like, I was so in support of all of the pipeline protests, but even at that level, no one's talking about that. We're talking about nanotechnology in the water cycle. Like, it's one thing that's terrible with the pipelines, but once it's all consuming and we have no way of even knowing the extent to which we're poisoned by it, you know, it's at that point, that is why I consider this a spiritual engagement. Because I don't know that if that's where we're standing right now, if this is what we're actually facing, is this like not a coronavirus unseen enemy, but a nanotechnology and nanorobotics, a geoengineering type of scenario, you know, weaponized EMF against all of life. How do you combat that? Like with a better currency system or with an off the grid power? Like, to me, it feels like an awakening, a spiritual awakening, and one in which it is not nationalist, but it is respecting the faith and cultural practices of all people on the earth to be connected to their lands, to their traditions, to their soil, to have autonomy and agency over their own lives. And again, in that way, it is profoundly an anti-imperial project that we're about, that the US has such a direct involvement in so much of the harm that has happened. And I did not realize it on Sunday when we went out to do that revocation until right before we walked out the door. I was just scrolling through my social media feed, and my friend Jason had posted that on April 4th, and that was the day, April 4th, 1967, Dr. King had delivered his address against the Vietnam War at Riverside Church in New York City. And then a year to the day later, he was murdered. So it was all on this same day. So it was a very weighty day to actually, that speech of repositioning it not simply as a civil rights struggle, but a struggle against empire and poverty, that had put him, that was, you know, the countdown of his life, was to make that pivot. And I think that is what the task is before us, is that in addressing this biosecurity state, it's not simply about our freedom, our immediate freedom from these health passes, but is actually this larger question of the scorched path, the green path, the transactional militarized machine path, or an awakening towards some healing. And what that looks like, I don't mean to be flippant that is in any way going to be easy or that I have all the answers, but you can't get there until you actually know that there's a road you're supposed to walk.
Exactly. One of my favorite authors, his name is Daniel Quinn. I'm not sure if I'm sure somebody's probably told you about the book Ishmael at some point, since you do this type of work.
I haven't read it.
It's amazing, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it. But one thing he says is part of the reason it's so difficult to articulate like an indigenous or an animist, he uses the word animist worldview, is because, you know, first of all, we're brought up in this culture, which is like the antithesis to an animist worldview. So that's, first of all, that's the language that we have to use to try to describe this animist worldview, where the language is not even set up for us to be able to do that. But right. He said if he had to boil it all the way down, it would be that there is no one right way to live. Our culture, we're looking for the right way to live, you know, nuclear family, agriculture, animal husbandry, you know, basically it leads to perpetual war, essentially, because then you have to have a hierarchy in society where there's the, the bankers or the merchants, and bankers are basically modern day merchants. You see where I'm going with this, because it was that time period about 10,000 years ago where one culture said, we know the right way to live, and we ended up with this, what you would call an imperial conquest, and we have basically taken over. I mean, people try to discern between like Eastern and Western cultures, and yes, there are some essentially superficial differences when you compare those two worldviews to an animist worldview. Like the Eastern, it seems like they're more mindful, but you're still looking for something else to save you, or it's this sense of I don't know, I'm not well versed enough in like Eastern Buddhist Hindu worldview, but there's still a sense of like you need to be saved, whether it's something inside of you or outside of you. Whereas animist worldview is everything's alive, and there really is no one right way to live. It's hard to articulate because anything that you say can, well, you don't have to live that way. It's like it's not like there's one side of each coin, because one side is the imperial side and the other side is freedom. So, but how do you organize freedom? It's like there's no one right way, but you have to, how do you enforce? You can't say that their way is the wrong way. You just have to force them to say, you can live any way you want, and we're gonna let you out of your prison. You guys are
That's
welcome.
what I'm trying to do with the blockchain conversation.
Right?
I'm like, I don't want to argue with anybody. I have the way I see it. There's other ways, people see it other ways. You can choose. Just know sometimes what you choose will have consequences. Like, that's part of it. Like we should, especially if people are giving options, know what your options are. There's not one way for everybody,
What would you recommend on an
know.
economic level, like on a transactional level right now? I mean, the crypto space definitely scares me when it comes to the loss of privacy aspect and all of this internet of bodies, the whole fourth industrial revolution. But then it's like, well, at this point, it seems like the US dollar and most fiat currencies are 95% electronic. And then the paper is just getting devalued more and more each day. They're printing so much. I don't know if you've seen the money supply charts over the last year, but listen, that crypto certainly has.
I know, but do you think crypto money is real? I don't think it's real either.
No, I don't either.
Like
I don't either. But
401ks, I don't know that it's real.
I don't think any money is real, but it's the belief system. So how do we get people to adjust their belief system to be able to operate in a system that isn't destroying the planet?
Well, the thing is, it's not necessarily individual people who are destroying the planet. It is structures. And again, that gets back to the militarism and the debt finance. I mean, we have a global economic system that runs on war, pollution, and debt.
Yep.
So that, and that's not something, there are many people who are making 6-figure salaries who are working in those sectors, but the vast majority of people are not. And so when we get back to it, like this framing that humans are a parasite on the earth, it's actually not most people. Most people are decent people. It is the people, these couple hundreds of billionaires who are scraping and squeezing every last bit out of the planet and running these wars and running, it's not just regular people. Regular people are living in the machine that's been built at that structure and like trying to navigate it. But I don't think fundamentally it is regular people who are the problem.
But doesn't it seem like most of them are, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but maybe convinced that they need money or that they need to operate it, they need to transact, they need to interact with the man or the system in order to survive?
Well, yeah, but at this point, like that's the awakening part. And I will admit, I'm relatively new to this. I was just a pretty normal person until about 5 or 6 years ago. I was good at it. I was a good student and I did the things. And then I fell into something that was like, wow, there's this awakening point.
Right.
And to me, I feel like, and I often say, I hope that they're not able to execute the plans as they talk about them. I'm not guaranteed that they'll be able to scale this blockchain stuff. I'm not guaranteed that they'll be able to figure out like this transhumanist stuff, that there are the digital twinning or the 6G. Maybe they won't. Maybe it's some of it's hot air and it won't come to pass. But I think given the amount of money behind it, we have to take it seriously.
Right.
But if we're taking it seriously, those stakes are so high that it's hard to imagine conforming to a system that really would like to reduce you to a digital cartoon character.
Right.
And trap you in a closet and have you compete for gig work with a haptic suit.
But that's what I'm saying. It's like if people knew that, then they wouldn't continue to participate in the way that they do.
But see, that's the problem, is the spatial web and the AI, the digital identity, the digital twinning, the digital straw man, that and even the I believe that the gene therapy tracking that will be used towards this human cybernetic system will be tracked on an electronic blockchain health record. I mean, they need very nuanced health data to run these programs if they're not just planning on killing bunches of people, which they may be. But if they're planning on actually re-engineering people to some end, they need very good records. And that's going to be a blockchain record. So the challenge is that I'm one of the few people who's surfacing these interconnections, and that those people who have a stake, so to speak, in the crypto space, including many alt media figures who are also accepting crypto payments for their income stream, are then put in a bind to talk about the other parts. Because if you talk about the other parts, then some of your standing gets less stable, right? And the academics aren't going to talk about it, and the banks aren't going to talk about it, and if the alt media isn't going to talk about it, then who's going to talk about it? Not many people.
Right.
And that's a hard spot to be in. And I'm like, I'm not making this shit up. I'm not. We need to actually have some ethical conversations about what it means to live in a militarized video game. Yeah. And we can't just say, well, we're going to have the white hat version of the militarized video game over here for people who choose to live in our libertarian agorist world. Like, well, what about those of us who just don't want to live in any of that? We should have, that should also be a right. And there should be really, like, I don't get to decide for everybody. Surely I don't get to, but people need to have informed choice, and they're not being informed, in my opinion. At the level they should be a year into this nonsense. Like there should be a lot more. Actually, I will pitch my friend Steffers. She just wrote a really nice piece the blog is called A Piece of Mindful. It's several authors, but she has one on crypto and transhumanism and the spatial web today up, and it's very good. So I encourage people to.
What about the people that like? It seems to me like I've tried bringing this stuff up with some of my friends, and it's like some of them are just like, well, what are we gonna do about it? like they've already given up, and it's like it's almost like a nihilism. It's like, but we need those people to see that they're important to
yeah.
Us.
But see, that's why I think if you imagine it as a spiritual engagement, you're like, okay, that you can do. Like if you have a certain amount of time, and I'm talking a peaceful, like a principled, peaceful resistance movement, right? This is show up with your dandelions and, have a concert somewhere, have a dance party somewhere, have a collective meal somewhere that is significant. And I want to get a map that I can put pinpoints so people can claim different sites, or people can research their own. I mean, really just put pay for success or nanotechnology or, biocomputing or something in your where you live, and something is going to come up, and then go there and just say, this is like, I think what is happening will, and I think there's stuff about physics involved. I think there's stuff about entanglement. I think there's stuff about like uncertain futures. I think that, and I'm not trying to be corny, but what other choice? You can either give up and say it's done and I'll just live as a video game in a closet and be depressed, or you can live the time you have in a principled way, which for me says, let's say it's not okay. Let's teach other people. Let's be in collective, like a collective energetic space. Let's hug each other. Let's, play music together. Let's be human as long as we have that. Because that is beautiful. And that's what I've gotten out of these trips to New York, is that there are people who are intensely being human. And it's almost like being in a pitched battle, is that you find someone you might not know, like you find people with whom like you would never, like you don't need to worry with the small talk. You just get to the point. Are you this kind of, do you believe in this? Are we together in this? And you're like tight. And that's an amazing gift to me. Like you don't have no bullshit, you just are like, you connect at that level. And that is viscerally human. And that is the chaos. And that is the unexpectedness that the system doesn't want.
Right. Yep. Well put.
I mean, that's what I've seen. I mean, again, I can't say that it would be the same for everybody, but I can only tell you what my experience is.
Certainly. I honestly don't have a whole lot more. I really do. So first of all, for my listeners, I want you guys to check out, Alison did a 5-part YouTube series called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I think it was like the global technocracy takeover was the rest of the title. She did a 2-part podcast with Sayarji that was incredibly detailed. The maps were really, I mean, anybody who is skeptical as to whether or not this is, we're being like fear mongers or something, like the maps are there. Like I didn't have Alison go into too much of the proof because I've watched so much of her stuff at this point that it's overwhelming.
Now they're erasing all the stuff out of Little Sis. That's the other thing. Like now they know how powerful those maps are. They kicked me out and then they kicked me out again. And now they've deleted all the maps and now they're deleting the entries.
Yeah, so the maps were really like, that's anybody who like wanted to be a real skeptic about all this. It's like you can just look at the connections between these people that are associated with these companies, and those companies have deals and smart contracts with this company and these people, and the map that shows the web of connections it's undeniable. I mean, it's just undeniable. So I highly recommend you checking out all of basically Alison's YouTube channel, but the ones that I highly recommend are the Utopia is a Scam podcast, the Mind Wars podcast, the 5-part series I just mentioned, as well as the 2-part podcast with Sayarji. But I'm sure all of them are amazing. Alison,
I do have one on augmented reality that I did with my friend Joseph, and Joseph is 30 years in. He's a combat vet, and then he did 30 years with artificial intelligence and video game design and blockchain and AI. Very knowledgeable guy. And so it was last August, we did like a 3-hour series on this mixed web and spatial reality impact investing. So if people want to know more about that, and I did one with Guns and Butter and Tom Cowan also on this game. Those are shorter, like an hour. And then I'll also say, so I am collaborating. We're trying to get this Inspired Ground project off the ground. And I would really invite anyone who's interested in this idea of like a healing get together communal thing with some dandelions, a revocation. We're going to come up with some models that people can have, but we ask people to riff on those. The only idea is that it's coming from an affirmative place. That's going to be on inspiredgroundproject.com. And then also Raul Diego is creating a collaborative platform for ratings about blockchain, gamification, impact finance, this larger agenda, the fourth industrial revolution. It's called siliconicarus.com, I think. So, and some of my material is up there as well. So we're trying to build these like non-paywalled spaces where people can collaborate and share work. And, even though digital community isn't great, like to also encourage online and offline stuff so that we can support each other.
Offline is definitely one I prefer, but with the whole COVID hysteria, which I'm not sure exactly. I can guess basically how you see this farce or pandemic, but there are a lot of people who buy into it, and then that kind of in and of it.
So the thing is, like, this idea of healing is like, my position is, if people can come from a place of trying not to judge one another, if someone shows up and they have a mask on, like, don't berate them.
Right.
They shouldn't berate you. Like, you're human. The people are not, we are not each other's enemy. Like, masked people, like, at the fundamental level, they want us to consider each other enemies. And it's very hard not to be challenged and upset by this. Like, I get that, but that's what they most want. And so actually one of the ideas I had, I want to make some fabric with these dandelion, like different slogans that I can print on canvas fabric and then sew on felt to make handmade buttons, like pins. And I want to do it it's very simple sewing, just up and down, you know, in a public place, in a park. Like, go somewhere public and sit and make something. And, you know, you could have some balloons or have some flowers or have whatever, and then just be there and see who comes up and has a conversation. Because bit by bit, that's the vibrational, like, for me, it is that kind of signals intelligence that is going to be countered to this hive mind mentality.
Right.
And it's not a huge numbers game. It can just be some. It doesn't have to be thousands.
Yeah, I've just started an organization. I'm calling it Network, which I know is kind of like a play, because network is usually a word used in like the computer realm, but it's offline. And what I want to do is set up cornhole boards, ladder ball games, bocce ball games, washer toss, frisbee, hacky sack, hula hoop, and literally just bring all the equipment in my pickup truck to the closest park, just throw it out there and invite some friends. And, you know, maybe 3 of them show up, maybe 10, 15 show up, and whatever happens, but we talk, you know, talk about these things and basically build community. Because I think ultimately, and I kind of, I see where you, I don't want to say avoid or ignore, but you kind of skirt the like economic or transactional, because that's not ultimately what's going to serve to heal us. What heals us is having a deeper relationship and understanding each other on more of a human level than like, this is someone that I can do business with, you know?
Yeah.
So
that was our intention, like our group intention on Sunday. We said it was like, as like beings connected to you know, the Mother Earth, that our intention was to try to restore balance in ourselves and like among the earth as a whole. Like, it's this restoration of a balanced relationship from both with the humans and the larger world. And that's because everything's so profoundly out of balance right now.
Yeah, and this seems a little off topic, but back to something Daniel Quinn had mentioned when he was talking about biodiversity being an actual strength of the ecosystem. And we've actually weakened our own species by eliminating biodiversity within our own ecosystem or within the planet, because we're killing off all these species simply because they don't serve us. Or, you know, we've taken it's, you know, in the 1800s was the first time where a species was brought to extinction for purely commercial purposes. It wasn't even something that we ate. It was like their fur or their down feathers or something. I don't remember exactly what it was, but purely commercial purposes, we took an entire species to extinction just to serve what? Profit?
Well, and you know, that's one of these things. I mean, blockchain is about tracking supply chains largely too. Like, it's this, and that's being sold as like a wonderful thing. But what people aren't understanding is that we're the supply chain. We're being flipped from being the consumers to being the consumed by this system in this post-human world. And so we have to come to grips. And my friend Varun is very eloquent on sort of the psychosis of consumer culture, right? And sort of globalization, but understanding, you know, our impacts and like the chickens coming home to roost sort of thing. Really having a deeper reckoning with our relationship to the material world and identifying ourselves as consumer goods, you know, and increasingly as we become digitalized avatars and our consumption becomes digitized, but there's still this impact of, you know, the data centers and, you know, it's a different kind of environmental impact of that kind of digital consumerism and, you know, these NFTs. And it's just, it's kind of a whole crazy other layer of, you know, the digital virtual consumer world, but it's morphing because that's how capitalism, it needs to keep growing. And if the left, if people who are under, like, and that's what I worry about on like the more libertarian side, people are understanding this isn't like, I'm going to control my small town. It's that the capitalism has gone inverted into these virtual worlds, and that everything is becoming a market, a free market in trading and these cryptocurrencies of everything. And it's a little, yeah, it's a bit much for people to absorb. It's like you need to baby step people into it, but it's like, hurry, you know? So that's why I try to boil it down to natural life. Like we're in an epic spiritual engagement around natural life. Can we all get on board with that?
Yeah. One term that because of what you were just saying, one term I would maybe ask you to go a little bit deeper than some of the rest of the stuff on is social impact bonds.
Yeah.
I mean, that one really got me too. It's like, that's digital slavery is another term for it essentially. And that might sound radical, but when you look into it, that's what a social impact bond is.
It is. Well, so there's a really good lecture by Dr. Justin Leroy. It was like social impact bonds and the afterlife of slavery. And he did a whole, it's only like an hour long, but it's really foundational about sort of the legacy of slavery and the Zong massacre and the role of the insurance industries. But he gave it at the Whitney Museum of Art, actually, for a friend and colleague, Cameron Rowland, who was a ready-made artist. He did ready-made art around the carceral state. And so as part of this exhibit at the Whitney on debt, he used his allocation of funding to create art to buy a share in the social impact bond, this Ventura County impact bond around juvenile, offenders, and then displayed it because you could only get the terms of the bond if you bought in. So it's interesting now on the Ventura County social impact bond, the Whitney Museum of Art is a part owner in that bond, which is kind of an interesting fact. But so this idea of a social impact bond is essentially reimagining our lives and social relationships as future debt projections, and that there is an indebtedness that's tied to our use of public services, whether that's being educated, whether that is healthcare, whether that is housing, access or subsidies, food subsidies, being involved in the judicial system, getting substance treatment, being in foster care. All of these have numbers attached to them. And this is what social science centers at institutes at various Ivy League universities, they all set up these equations and these cost offsets. And then they say, well, if we can provide an evidence-based what works intervention, we will pay this much money, which is a smaller amount than we would pay if all these bad things happen to you and we would have to pay a lot more to fix you after the fact. We'll just preemptively fix you. Only the problem is it's essentially pre-crime. They don't say that, but it's essentially they're using all of these data analytics and predictive profiling to intervene in people's lives in really damaging ways. The profit center in the social impact bonds or pay for success finance is in that gap between what we pay for the current intervention and what we would have paid. So they take out a little slice for their profit. This concept was developed and scaled initially by social finance, which was backed by Sir Ronald Cohen, who is formerly with Apex Partners in the UK in London. And Peterborough Social Impact Bond was the first one. It was a prison one. So the cost offset was that people did not return to prison. Now, the problem is that the terms of these agreements, which are essentially like privatizing government services, privatizing services that the government should just be de facto providing, but then the government through austerity says we can't provide it unless we can be assured that it works. And so they outsource it to these nonprofits, some of whom are faith-based nonprofits, to do these social welfare services under conditions of a performance-based contract. The profit isn't in the tiny slice. That's what people need to understand. A lot of folks would say, well, I don't understand how you can make money privatizing social welfare. That doesn't seem very profitable. The problem is now there's a lot of poverty. So they're going to turn that all into profit. The profit isn't in the tiny slice of return on investment. It is actually in the fact that they're going to securitize all the debt and that hedge funds are going to trade off of that debt.
Right. And
but the game, really the game can't go unless you have the structure. They can't run the bets unless the game goes on. So they have to build the game. And that game is being built right now. And it's alternately called, originally it was social impact bonds, and they couldn't bring those to scale. And then it was pay for success finance. Here, Michael Bloomberg brought that over from London with Sir Ronald Cohen to Rikers Island, was the first one in the United States. But now they have them tied to housing, pre-K, addiction treatment, like quite a number of other things. And really what they need, because to figure out the cost offset to legitimate it, even though it is illegitimate, but to make it seem like it's legitimate, they need all of the data to slosh around in a big pool, because they can't justify taking profit off the fact that you didn't become addicted if they can't track that against some intervention they put you on in middle school, right? They can't track if they got a cost offset, if they gave your parent a housing subsidy, that your test scores got better. All of that data has to interlock, and that's what's going to come with digital identity. And that digital identity system is something that the World Wide Web Consortium has been working on for like 15 years. And I had thought it was going to come through education transcript records, but clearly now it seems like the much bigger plan is to have it come through these medical passport protocols. So they'll set up the medical passports and then layer in the blockchain identity. They'll start to layer on your Fed wallet, right? Your blockchain Fed wallet, your programmable money, and all of the assets that you will get. It will be like starter money in a game of Monopoly, and that they will track you how you use it, if you're using it appropriately, and if you are behaving according to the protocols assigned to you by your social worker. So whether that's in addiction or workforce training, and with your QR codes and with your payments and with your tracking and with wearable technology and telehealth and teletherapies, they can really engineer people's lives to a degree that is almost unimaginable. And that is what people are not grasping now. That is that the blockchain and the digital identity and the spatial web is going to interface with programmable money and impact investing to create this global digital prison. And it is not far off, and it is not in China. This is something that is hatched in London and in New York City and in Chicago and the Bay Area. This is a colonial project.
Yep. One thing, when you were just going through the social impact, basically description there, that I remembered you saying from a previous podcast is, what's really scary about these things being basically hedge fund vehicles is that some people are going to short them.
Yeah.
So that means
then you're living in the spatial web, potentially where things get out of hand and AI starts to influence how the physical world interfaces with you. And then maybe somebody's betting that you are unable to fulfill your obligations on this pathway, right? Like you don't get the bus. Your bank account is overdrawn. You're like, all of these contracts that you're interfacing with might go haywire, and there's not even a person to call up and go like, hey, I meant to get there on time, but the bus got detoured. Like, they'll fake you out.
And the people that are betting against you are going to do everything within the rules of the game to make sure that you don't succeed because their money's on it.
So that is my fear around the crypto space, is that people are not understanding that it's Peter Thiel who's going to be, and Pierre Omidyar and, Branson and the Vatican and the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund and whatever. And like, now you've got the world running, with a bunch of robot police dogs running all over, it's like, it literally, if you understand what it must have been like to try to escape slavery, this is what's coming. This plus the reservation system with cultural erasure, dispossession, reneged contracts, family separation, abuse, all of that is on our doorstep. And so to me, in order for us to engage with this from a spiritual standpoint, there has to be a reckoning and understanding of that history. Not from a woke paralyzing standpoint, not from a like simply stand here and be shamed and into inaction, but to simply that we have to be able to process it in a principled way and then join together with that understanding of that history of who we are.
Yeah,
and that's where I've fallen out with most of the people on the left, because I don't think that they've gotten beyond, like, I've had people tell me, well, Alison, you don't really have a place speaking into this. And I'm like, no, I'm part of this equation. I'm not going to be here to tell a person in an impacted community how they should deal with it. I don't presume to tell people. but I feel it is my responsibility to share what I know with anyone who is willing to listen. And that includes white people. That includes the people who are building it. That includes people in Salt Lake City, where I went to give a number of talks because it's all being built there. That involves it, talking to people in Israel because it's being built there. I will talk to whoever I need to talk to say, don't put children on blockchain.
Right. Yep. And I think it harks back exactly to something that you said earlier, which is, I mean, ethics are absent from the public square discussion. I mean, I don't hear people talk about or even questioning the ethics behind any of this stuff. I mean, the ethical aspect of it seems to be people like you and the extreme minority, but ethics in general. I mean, I think, like you said, again, this stuff isn't new. And I think it's all the result of our culture has ignored the ethical aspect of all of this for centuries, really.
Well, I will say I'm in an unusual position because I can do it. And I understand a lot of people can't. Like, we live on a society that runs on debt.
Right? But anybody can have a discussion with their friend on what's right and what's wrong. And
that's true. And that may be happening offline and in less public ways. I don't want to put myself above other people. I think people have different positions in this machine. True. And so in that way, I have more freedom to speak on the things that I feel called to speak of. And because of my life experience being in a city that is being targeted by this, that I have eyes to see it in ways that other people may not.
Of course. I think where I was going is more like on a collective conscious level. I think like even talking about ethics seems to be almost taboo, unless there's already that rapport built between the two people having the discussion that, hey, we want to figure out, or we want to solve some problems, some societal problems. What's right, what's wrong, how do we do it? Whereas it almost seems like because of the polarization, I think it starts in politics, but all the way down into academia, where, talking about ethics has almost reached the level of taboo because it's like, oh, you don't want to like offend somebody's religion or political stance. A lot of people don't even like talking about religion and politics, but
see, I think if we framed it as, how do we be better relatives? Because right now the propaganda and the media, it is meant to polarize.
Yeah, dividing.
So if you read most of what I write and what I know, it's totally bipartisan. All of this is bipartisan. Everybody's in on it. It's a power play. And I speak my truth. I don't change up how I talk depending on what the audience is or whatever. I speak the way I speak, but I try to be respectful. And I think if we understand each other's basic humanity and we frame it in that way, I think most people are receptive. It's surprising to me, to be very honest about, my beliefs, which are pretty strong, that most people get it. I don't get a lot of pushback. Mostly just the blockchain people. But like if you look at my Twitter feed and you see who follows me on Twitter, I mean, I have like 6,000 followers or whatever, like it is a huge spectrum of people. Yeah. They are across because I'm telling the truth.
Yeah. And I mean,
I'm trying to, as best I know it, I'm telling the truth of what I know from a place of caring for what happens to all the world, all the children of the world, all the creatures of the world. And most people, I think, get that. So if we come at it from that place, as opposed to trying to find each other's weak points and poke at them, we actually might get somewhere.
Beautifully put.
I mean, I know I'm just learning as I go along, but people have been surprisingly wonderful to me.
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me because, like you said, you're honest and you're consistent. And overall, you're certainly not partisan. I don't get any like polarizing type of vibe from you at all.
So I'm like, they're all in on it. Right. It's like, people like, who do you trust, Alison? Like moms, right. like people who don't have anything to gain from spinning this.
Right. Yeah.
We're not spinning it. When we hope we're wrong.
To go back to finish this up, you know, as seeing it as a spiritual war, and anybody who's listened to my podcast knows that I'm an avid Toltec, the Toltec worldview. The four agreements are they're near and dear to me. And what one of the, I guess, metaphors that Don Miguel talks about, just in regard to life, is the track of love and the track of fear. And I think really everything comes down to that. But the irony here is, it seems like the information is very scary. So it's like, is this the track of fear? But I don't see it that way, because you have to face your fears. And like the whole like rainbows and unicorns stuff, it's like, we can't ignore the problems that we're facing. And so yes, there's the track of love and the track of fear, but I think the track of love isn't this like hippie type of crap. It's like you have to actually address the problems, because love is strong, and love wants you to be fully healthy. And like, if you're avoiding that darkness, if you're avoiding the problems that we face as a society or on a personal level, then I think it just grows. You know, when you avoid that, it just grows. And so when I hear people say things like, you know, you're just trying to scare people, or like this stuff is like scary or overwhelming or whatever, it's like, I think it's actually the track of love. You know, I see actually addressing the problems that we're facing is a act of love.
That's beautiful. I agree.
And it's something
And
that
it's powerful. It is power. Read Wrinkle in Time. If you haven't read A Wrinkle in Time in a while, Madeline L'Engle, 1970s. I read it in elementary school. I've read it again recently. Love wins. In the end, it's across like cosmic physics, time and space. Right. And the kid is trapped in IT. It's technocracy. And Meg, the sister, I'll give it away, but like love wins. I mean, that's the power. But we have to also risk being vulnerable. And that's not easy for people.
Exactly right. There's a book that Don Miguel wrote. It's probably one of my favorites, but I feel like it's one of those things where if you don't already kind of have a feel for that worldview, it's going to be too far out for a lot of people. But it's called Beyond Fear. And it implies that you have to acknowledge that you have fear in order to get beyond it. You know, a lot of people, the four agreements is easy for them to pick up and read. It's like, oh, these are agreements that can help my life. And it's written in a way that's a lot easier for people to digest. But Beyond Fear can really hit people like viscerally. And it's like, you have to acknowledge that you have fear in order to get beyond it. Like, you can't fully like soak in the love that is all around us until you defeat the fear that's within. And then even once you've done that, then you look at your family or your community or, you know, your country, and you want to solve the problems that are preventing love from being shared between people. And I don't know. I feel like I'm talking a little bit too much, but like you said, love wins. And at the same time, that love has to be strong, and it has to be willing to face fear. You don't want to live in fear, but love is something that is not afraid to face fear.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I think these little celebrations are so beautiful. Like, I mean, Council on Foreign Relations is some pretty deep stuff, you know? Yeah. And we just stood there and we said, we're not doing right there. You know, like we just started at the top, right? But it was beautiful. It was like it was quite amazing. And part of it was like we're debating about shifting vibrations or whatever, but like we were transforming ourselves. Like the 25 of us transformed one another in that. And whether or not that impact conveyed to the people who occupy those positions of power, inherently it's actually about manifesting it within ourselves. And we can do that for one another. I mean, that's pretty incredible. So
thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy. I keep tabs on your YouTube channel. I see videos going up all the time. So I really appreciate you coming on and doing this with me. I'm gonna be in touch. I'm not gonna say that I'll definitely have you on for another podcast, because to be honest, I'm not I'll have you on, or like some people that I feel really important about. But as far as building the community, I'd rather do what I was talking about earlier and just like go to the park and get my cornhole board out and my hacky sack and my frisbee and my bocce ball set and my ladder.
Now remind me, you're in Virginia? Is that where you're in? Okay.
Yeah, in Richmond. I'm sorry?
Oh, the Federal Reserve. Can you go do cornhole in front of the Federal Reserve?
That's a good idea. I know exactly what it is.
I want you to do that for me. Okay, I'm going to put it on our website. We need a variety. It can't all be quilting.
Right, right. I'm going to do
Get
it.
some dandelions and sprinkle them on the steps of the Richmond Federal Reserve and play some hacky sack. That would be awesome.
I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. Thank you again.
All right.
Have a great evening.
Good night.